I can cook you Thanksgiving. Please don't turn me away. The Apache widow begged. Freezing. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The cold settled early that evening, the kind that crept into the Wyoming frontier long before winter officially arrived, and Harlan Pike felt it pressing against his coat as he rode the final stretch toward his homestead. He kept his eyes forward, scanning the dim land with the quiet focus of a man who had spent years relying on caution more than comfort. The wind had picked up since afternoon, brushing the dry grass flat and carrying a gritty sting against his cheeks, and his horse moved at a slow, uneven pace, tired from the long day spent checking the northern fence line. He hadn't meant to stay out so late, but a broken post had taken longer to fix than he expected, and he was thinking mostly about warming his hands by the stove when he finally saw the outline of his cabin through the thinning light. Harlan had lived alone for nearly 10 years, choosing isolation after losing two brothers during a violent dispute with a neighboring outfit. He had walked away from what little family he had left, deciding a solitary life was safer than risking more loss. His mission since then had been simple: keep the land running enough to survive, avoid trouble, and stay far from anyone who might drag him back into the old kind of conflict he had spent years escaping. As he reached the yard, he noticed the usual signs of routine: tools leaning against the barn wall, the rope he'd left draped over the corral post, and the water barrel sitting undisturbed near the porch. What made him slow his steps, though, was the sight of something lying beside that barrel. It wasn't shaped like anything he recognized from usual chores. The way it curled inward made his stomach tighten. He dismounted quickly, his boots sinking into the cold dirt, and he approached with a steady, tense caution. His mind ran through possibilities: injured animal, stranger, trap. But when he crouched down and the lantern glow from the window caught the figure clearly, he felt a shock of concern hit him hard. A woman lay there, curled tightly to herself, her bronze skin showing through the frost that clung to her shoulders. She wore a thin deerskin dress with beadwork that looked worn from long travel, and her hair hung in tangled strand around her face. Her body trembled in small, sharp motions, and her breath came out in short, struggling gasps. The cold had gotten her badly. Harlan leaned closer, his heartbeat steady but heavy, and touched her arm through his glove. Her eyelids fluttered open halfway, revealing dark eyes clouded by pain and exhaustion. She tried to focus on him, failing at first, then managed to whisper something that made him pause completely. "I can cook you a Thanksgiving meal. Please don't turn me away." Her voice was barely there, thin and cracked, but the desperation behind it made him stand frozen for a short moment. He wasn't used to hearing anyone ask him for anything anymore. He wasn't used to having anyone near his home at all. He slid his arms beneath her gently, feeling how light she was, and lifted her with careful strength, making sure not to jostle her more than necessary. Her head rested weakly against his coat, and he felt her body twitch from another chill as he carried her up the porch steps. He opened the cabin door with a shoulder and stepped inside, immediately aware of how cold she must have been because even the weak heat from his stove felt warmer by comparison. He set her down in the chair closest to the small stove and moved quickly to add more wood, wanting the heat to rise fast. The lantern hanging on the wall gave off a steady amber glow, spreading across her trembling shoulders, revealing scrapes on her hands and the faint tear along the hem of her dress. She looked like she had been out in the open for far too long. Harlan knelt briefly to pull a blanket from the trunk near his bed and laid it carefully over her lap. She caught the edge of it with stiff fingers, holding on as if unsure the warmth was meant for her. When she tried to speak again, her voice shook. She said her name was Taya. She said she had lost her husband in a border raid. She said she had stayed with extended family for a time, but tensions had grown heavy, and eventually she had been told to leave. She hadn't eaten a real meal in days. Harlan listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening slightly with each detail. He didn't ask questions. He didn't press for anything she wasn't ready to say. He just stood near the stove, letting the room warm up, thinking about the fact that she had nearly died a few feet from his door. When she tried to rise, insisting she could cook something as she had promised, her legs wobbled under her weight. Harlan stepped forward instinctively, stopping beside her while keeping his hands at his sides so she wouldn't feel pressured or trapped. She steadied herself on the table, drawing slow breaths as she forced herself to remain upright. She moved like someone who had spent weeks fighting to stay alive and refused to give in even when her body was failing. She found his knife in the small pile of vegetables on the counter and began slicing with movements that showed long familiarity. Her hands shook each time she lifted her arm, but she kept going, pushing herself to keep moving. Harlan watched carefully, his thoughts shifting from worry to a quiet respect. She wasn't trying to earn pity. She was trying to prove she had value, that she wasn't a burden. He stepped closer without speaking and placed a small handful of salt near her, an unspoken offer of help. She noticed the gesture and gave a faint nod, acknowledging the support without breaking her focus. The silence between them carried tension at first, but it wasn't hostile. It felt more like two people trying to understand each other's limits without crossing any. As she cooked, Harlan noticed details he hadn't before. The way she paused every few minutes to steady her breath, the way she flinched slightly each time the wind hit the cabin walls, the way she kept her back straight as if ready to bolt at any sudden movement. He realized she wasn't just cold. She was afraid. Not of him, exactly, but of being told she wasn't welcome here either. When the small pot of food was done, she handed him a plate with both hands, the effort clear in her eyes. They ate quietly, the simple Thanksgiving meal warming the room more than he expected. Taya kept glancing toward the door, waiting for a signal that she should leave. When she finally asked if he wanted her gone, her voice was barely audible. Harlan set his plate aside, met her eyes directly, and said a single word. No. She froze, not from fear, but from disbelief. Her shoulders eased by a fraction, her hands settling on the blanket. She didn't smile, didn't break down, didn't speak further. She simply let the relief settle into her body like something she hadn't felt in a long time. Harlan moved around the cabin, checking the shutters, sealing the draft under the door, and placing more wood on the fire, while Taya folded the blanket neatly across her legs. The air warmed slowly, the lantern flickered slightly from the rising heat, and the world outside faded into darkness. For the first time in years, Harlan felt the quiet of his home shift into something different. Not crowded, not noisy, just shared. For the first time in weeks, Taya felt a door stay open instead of closing in her face. The long winter ahead no longer felt impossible for either of them. The fire burned low by the time the night settled fully around the cabin, and Harlan Pike added another log with slow, steady movements, careful not to startle Taya as she shifted her weight beneath the blanket he had given her. She held the fabric close against her legs, watching the flames with guarded attention, her breathing more even than before, but still carrying a tightness that came from uncertainty rather than cold. Harlan noticed the way her eyes moved from the stove to the door and then to him, studying small details as if trying to understand what kind of man he was and whether she had made a mistake by surviving long enough to reach his porch. He didn't blame her. A woman traveling alone, wounded, and exhausted would have every reason to question where she could safely rest. Harlan reached for the kettle, poured hot water into a tin cup, and placed it carefully on the table near her, leaving enough distance so she wouldn't feel pressured. She reached for it slowly, her fingers still stiff, and he watched her lift it with a focused effort that showed how drained she truly was. He made a mental note that she needed real rest, food, and warmth before anything else. As she drank, she kept her gaze on the cup rather than him, which told him she wasn't ready to meet anyone's eyes yet. That was fine. He didn't need her to. The wind struck the cabin wall with a low thud that made her flinch, and Harlan understood instantly that she had been living with every gust, shadow, and footstep as a possible threat for far too long. He sat on the stool opposite her, bracing his elbows on his knees, and spoke in a calm, grounded tone. "You won't hear anyone outside tonight," he said. No neighbors close enough to wander this way. No riders passing through. She nodded once, her chest rising in a slow breath that eased some tension in her shoulders. And that small shift told him she was beginning to believe she was truly inside a safe place. There were questions she hadn't answered earlier, questions she likely expected would be forced on her. But Harlan had learned long ago that pushing someone in distress made them withdraw completely. Instead, he let the silence sit until she decided to break it. She set the cup down, fingers brushing the table lightly, and spoke with a voice that carried a mixture of strain and determination. "I walked for 3 days after crossing the ridge," she said. "I thought there would be camps or fires, anything. But I didn't see anyone. Just empty land." Harlan listened, understanding now why her dress was torn at the hem and why her feet were scraped. She had passed through country few dared to cross without company. He noticed something else then: her shoes, or rather the lack of them. She had thin moccasins that were worn nearly through at the soles, so damaged that they barely held shape. He hadn't seen that clearly when he carried her inside, and the sight made his throat tighten slightly. She had traveled through rocky terrain in those, and she had somehow kept moving despite the pain. He stood up, went to the corner where he kept spare supplies, and returned with a small tin of salve and a strip of cloth. Taya stiffened when she saw them, unsure if she was expected to offer something in return, but Harlan placed the items on the table without comment, then stepped back to give her space. She lowered her gaze, realizing he wasn't demanding anything, and reached out with hesitant fingers to take the salve. As she tended to the raw spots on her ankles, Harlan returned to the stove and checked the pot she had cooked from earlier to see if anything remained. There were only a few spoonfuls left, not enough for another meal, and he found himself wishing he had picked up more supplies during his last trip to town. He hadn't expected anyone else to need them. He glanced at her again, noticing how she moved the cloth carefully around her ankle, and he made a decision he had avoided for months. "I'll ride into town in the morning," he said, his voice steady but low. "We need more food. I'll be back before the sun drops." The word "we" made her pause, and she looked up briefly, her expression tightening with something close to disbelief. She didn't question it. She simply nodded once, accepting the shift in language as something she didn't want to challenge. Taya pulled the blanket tighter against her body and sat straighter, as if she didn't want sympathy to overshadow the fact she had survived this long on her own. She hesitated, then spoke again. "I didn't mean to come to your place. I was trying to reach the ridge line. I saw smoke earlier in the day, but lost track of it." Harlan understood why listeners might wonder how she ended up at his ranch specifically, and her explanation filled the missing piece clearly. She hadn't chosen him. She had chosen the warmth she thought she saw from a distance and followed it until her legs gave out. It explained why she collapsed inches from the door instead of somewhere else. He sat across from her again, his posture relaxed but attentive, and asked a question in a mild tone. "Did anyone follow you?" She hesitated, weighing the question, and her eyes lowered. "Not recently," she said, "but there were men 2 days behind me when I crossed the river. I hid until they passed, but I don't know if they turned back." Harlan felt a low heaviness settle in his gut, the kind that came from recognizing danger that wasn't immediate but could return without warning. He looked toward the window instinctively, scanning the shadows outside, even though he knew no one was out there tonight. The ridge blocked the nearest trail, and no one familiar with the land would travel at this hour. Still, it was the kind of detail he needed to know. Taya's breathing grew uneven as she recounted the memory, and Harlan leaned back slightly to avoid crowding her. He didn't push for more information. If something threatened her before, she would tell him when she felt ready. She watched him for a moment, trying to read his reaction, and the subtle calm in his expression seemed to steady her again. When she looked away, her gaze drifted toward the stove. "I can help in the morning," she said quietly. "With anything you need." Harlan shook his head once, firm but without harshness. "You rest tomorrow. You won't stand long without it." She pressed her lips together in a way that suggested she didn't fully agree, but the exhaustion in her face told him she understood the truth of it. The hour grew late, and the fire softened into a deeper glow. Harlan stood from the table and prepared a space for her on the cot near the stove, laying down an extra blanket and smoothing it out in a way that made the sleeping area look like a deliberate offer rather than a temporary arrangement. Taya watched each motion, her eyes following the care he took, and when he stepped back, she rose slowly from the chair and crossed to the cot with careful steps, her balance steadier now that the room held some warmth. Before lying down, she looked at him with a brief, searching expression. She wasn't asking for reassurance. She was checking whether he expected anything from her beyond taking the blanket and resting. When she found only the same steady calm she had seen earlier, her shoulders loosened by a small degree, and she settled onto the cot, pulling the blanket over her body with both hands. Harlan turned down the lantern, leaving only the low glow from the stove to light the room. He sat on the chair near the door, keeping watch over the quiet cabin in the same way he had done on countless nights alone. But this time, he wasn't listening for danger that might come for him. He was listening for anything that might disturb a rest. Outside, the wind pushed against the walls. Inside, the warmth slowly filled the small space. For the first time since her husband's death, Taya drifted into sleep without expecting to be woken by fear. And for the first time since he buried his brothers, Harlan felt the beginning of a responsibility he didn't turn away from. The morning light crept into the cabin slowly, slipping through the narrow space between the shutters and settling across the floor in a pale line that reached the cot where Taya slept. Harlan Pike sat in the same chair he had taken the night before, his back stiff from staying awake longer than he intended, but he didn't move until he was sure she was still breathing steadily. Her posture had changed since she first collapsed. Her shoulders lay more evenly, her hands no longer clenched tight against her chest, and the tension that had shaped her face yesterday had eased into something closer to simple exhaustion rather than fear. That shift answered one question listeners might have silently wondered: whether she was safe enough to truly sleep under someone else's roof. Harlan stood, stretching his arms once before moving quietly toward the stove so he wouldn't wake her abruptly. In the soft light, he noticed something he hadn't paid attention to the night before. Her dress had been torn not only at the hem, but also along the side seams, the damage consistent with traveling through thorny brush and rough terrain. That detail explained why she struggled to lift her arm when she cooked the meal. He set a small pot of water to warm, knowing she would need something hot when she woke. When he opened the door, the cold morning air rushed in with a sharp bite, but the sky was clear and the wind calmer than the night before. He stepped outside to saddle his horse, planning to make good time into town and return before dusk. As he tightened the cinch, he paused, realizing Taya had no spare clothing, no belongings, and no blanket besides the one he had given her. These were things listeners might wonder about, so he made a mental list of items to bring back: flour, dried beans, bandages, spare fabric, and something warm enough for her to wear until she could mend her dress. Before he mounted, he walked back to the door and glanced inside to check if she had stirred. She hadn't. Her breathing stayed steady, and her arm rested across her stomach in a way that suggested she had found a rare, temporary peace. He stepped in briefly, adjusted the blanket over her shoulders, then left again, closing the door gently so the latch settled without a loud click. The ride into town took him across open stretches where the land rolled unevenly toward a distant ridge, the light catching on frost that had settled overnight. Harlan kept his eyes moving across the terrain, checking the trail for tracks that didn't belong. He didn't see anything fresh, but the mention of the men following her still weighed on him. If they had been traveling as she described, they would likely move south rather than toward his ranch. Yet he wasn't the kind of man who relied on assumptions. Every mile he rode, he looked for signs: hoof prints, broken brush, ash from old fires, but found nothing that suggested strangers had crossed through recently. By the time he reached the outskirts of the small town, the morning had warmed slightly, and smoke rose from chimneys scattered along the wide dirt street. He rode past the general store, tied his horse, and stepped inside. The shelves carried the usual supplies: sacks of flour, jars of lard, bolts of fabric, and small tools. The owner, an older man with thinning hair and a stiff posture, greeted him with a nod but didn't ask questions. Harlan rarely spoke much here. He bought what he needed and left. Today, though, he gathered more than usual. He selected fabric that could be sewn into a warm garment, a pair of wool socks, salve for injuries, and enough food to last a week. The storekeeper raised an eyebrow at the unusual load and said lightly, "Expecting company?" Harlan kept his tone neutral. "Cold's early this year." The answer wasn't a lie, but also didn't invite curiosity. The man nodded, rang up the items, and handed him a small tin of coffee as a courtesy, saying it had been sitting too long on the shelf. Harlan accepted it, thinking Taya might appreciate something warm besides water. On the ride back, he stayed alert. Even if the trail had looked empty earlier, he wasn't willing to take risks. He kept his rifle tied across the saddle in easy reach, and his eyes scanned the ridge line more than once. It wasn't just concern for himself. He didn't want danger anywhere near the woman sleeping in his cabin. While he traveled, Taya woke inside the homestead with a sharp breath and sat upright too quickly, gripping the blanket as her surroundings returned to her in a rush. Her chest tightened until she recognized the walls, the stove, and the chair where Harlan had sat. She looked around slowly, expecting him to be inside, and when she realized she was alone, a flicker of panic pushed through her. She stood, unsteady on her feet, and moved to the window to check outside. The yard was quiet, the sky clear, the horse gone. That detail filled in another question listeners might have wondered, whether she trusted him yet. Her first instinct was to gather her things, but she didn't have any belongings to collect. The only items inside the cabin were his tools, his coat, the folded blanket, the pot of water warming on the stove, and the chair he had left pulled away from the table. She walked to the stove, touched the side of the pot, and realized he must have placed it before leaving. The warmth inside the cabin and the deliberate care behind those small actions eased her breathing again. He hadn't abandoned her. He had left to return. Still, she wanted to be sure she wasn't a burden. She stepped carefully across the room, checking the shutter latches, noticing the mud near the threshold he had tracked in, and began cleaning the small spots with a cloth she found near the basin. She moved slowly, her muscles sore, but she worked because staying still made her too aware of the silence. As she tidied the table, she spotted the strip of cloth he had given her the night before and touched it with thoughtful fingers, realizing he planned ahead more than he said. When Harlan returned hours later, she stood by the stove, her posture straighter than the night before, and the first thing he noticed was how closely she watched him walk through the door. Not with suspicion now, but with a clear intention to understand whether he carried any sign of trouble. When she saw only calm in his expression, her shoulders eased. He set the supplies on the table, and Taya's eyes widened slightly at the amount. Her gaze lingered on the fabric, then moved to the food, then to him. "You didn't need to get so much," she said. Harlan shrugged lightly. "Cold's coming fast." She understood the truth beneath the practical answer. She wasn't expected to leave. He pulled a chair away from the table and began sorting the items so she could see them clearly. She reached for the fabric, running her fingers along the edge, and for a moment she looked like she wasn't sure how to respond to someone preparing for her needs without expecting anything in return. She folded the cloth slowly, setting it aside with care, and her voice dropped to a quiet tone. "No one has done this for me in a long time." Harlan sat across from her, elbows resting lightly on the table, and asked a question he hadn't asked before. "What were you hoping to find when you left your family's camp?" She hesitated, the memory clearly difficult, but she answered with steady honesty. "A place where I didn't have to keep running from loss." Her gaze shifted briefly toward the window, then back to the items he brought. "I didn't expect it to be here." He didn't respond right away. He didn't need to. The silence between them was no longer strained. It was an understanding. Outside, the light began to fade, and the ridge cast a long shadow across the yard. Harlan stood and secured the latch on the door, then checked the window as a precaution. Taya watched him quietly, recognizing his movements for what they were, not suspicion, but protection. For the first time since meeting her, Harlan realized he wasn't acting out of obligation. Something in him had shifted the moment he saw her trembling beside that water barrel. Now, that shift was clearer. He didn't want her outside these walls while the world grew colder. And for the first time since her husband died, Taya allowed herself to think she might have reached a place where she didn't have to walk away when the weather changed. The light outside dimmed into a muted gray as the afternoon drifted toward evening, and Harlan Pike finished checking the shutters one last time before stepping back toward the table where Taya sorted the fabric he brought from town. Her movements were slower than earlier, but she handled every item with careful attention, spreading each piece in a neat line as if she needed to understand what belonged to her now and what she was allowed to use without being questioned. Harlan noticed her hesitation whenever she paused over something useful: flour, socks, the tin of salve, and he realized she was waiting for permission even though he had placed them in front of her. He pulled out the chair opposite her and sat down, letting the quiet fill the room in an easy way. The stove crackled softly, throwing a steady warmth that erased the sharp cold of the night before. Taya lifted the wool socks again, running her fingers across the fabric with a slow, thoughtful touch, and Harlan understood she was checking for damage, quality, anything that might hint at a hidden price. He leaned slightly forward, speaking in a tone that left no room for uncertainty. "They're for you. Everything I brought back is for you to use." She didn't look up immediately, but her breath steadied, and she folded the socks with a care that suggested she hadn't been given anything without expectation in a long time. The questions listeners might have been wondering: how much strength she had left, whether she could mend clothing, whether she had any skills besides cooking, were answered naturally as she reached for the fabric and examined it with practiced precision. She held the edge to the light, checking the weave, then nodded to herself in a way that reflected quiet confidence rather than doubt. "I can make something warm from this," she said. "It will take a day or two, but I can do it." Her voice carried a steadiness he hadn't heard the night before, and Harlan felt a small shift inside his chest, something close to relief that didn't show on his face. He watched the way she held the needle from the wooden box he kept in the drawer, testing its sharpness by pressing it lightly against her thumb. Her hands trembled faintly from fatigue, but her skill was obvious. Each motion practiced, deliberate, refined by necessity rather than hobby. Harlan realized then that listeners might be wondering what she had done before her husband's death and whether she had worked with her hands. He asked quietly, "Did you sew for your family?" She answered without looking up. "I made clothes, repaired blankets, fixed moccasins, anything that needed it. My husband hunted. I kept things together." The mention of her husband's role filled another unspoken question: how their lives had been divided before everything fell apart. Taya's voice softened as she spoke, but she didn't break. She worked the fabric through her fingers, measuring with her eyes, planning the first few stitches. Harlan didn't press the subject further. He understood that memories carried through simple tasks rather than long explanations. The wind outside picked up slightly, brushing against the cabin wall with a sound more patient than the night before. Harlan rose from his chair and added another log to the stove, noticing how Taya's eyes followed him with cautious attention. She wasn't suspicious anymore. She was trying to understand the rhythm of the place. How often he checked the shutters, how long the stove burned, how he moved around the room with routines shaped by years of solitude. She spoke again, her tone quieter now. "I thought I would die on that ridge." She didn't say it dramatically. She said it as a fact. The ground was too cold. I couldn't feel my hands. Harlan stopped with his back to the stove, absorbing her words before turning around. "You got close," he said plainly. She looked at the floor briefly, acknowledging the truth without shame. She set the fabric down and shifted her position, adjusting the blanket over her legs. Her eyes traced the cabin slowly, taking in details she hadn't paid attention to before: extra nails on the shelf, the worn edge of the rug, the patched stool near the door. These small things mattered to someone trying to learn whether they were safe. She seemed to register each one with a slow, thoughtful sweep of her gaze. Then she asked a question she had been holding back. "Why do you live way out here alone?" It wasn't confrontational. It wasn't fearful. It was honest curiosity. something listeners likely wonder themselves. Harlan sat again, leaning back slightly in the chair. He didn't look away from her, but he didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his tone carried a weight shaped by years of grief. I lost two brothers in a fight that never should have happened. After that, I didn't want to be around anyone who could pull me back into trouble. She studied him closely, seeing the sincerity behind the words. So you stay away from people, she said, not as judgment, but as understanding. He nodded once. It makes life quieter. Taya glanced at the stove, then at the items he brought from town, and her voice dropped again. But I'm here. Harlan met her gaze without hesitation. You needed help. Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the blanket, a small reaction that revealed more than any long explanation could have. She wasn't used to someone offering help without conditions. She wasn't used to being accepted simply because she existed in a dangerous situation. A sudden knock of wind at the window made her flinch, not as sharply as the night before, but enough that Harlan noticed. He stood and checked the latch again, pressing the wood firmly into place. When he stepped back, Taya's breathing had already returned to a calmer pace. She looked toward the door for a moment, her brows tightening as if sorting through a lingering concern. Then she asked something that had been unspoken since she arrived. Will those men come this way? Her voice steadied at the end, showing she wanted a practical answer, not comfort. Harlan walked to the window and scanned the darkening yard. Not if they knew the direction you took. And if they don't know this place exists, they won't find it. She exhaled slowly, the uncertainty in her posture shifting into something closer to guarded relief. That question about the men she feared was one listeners had likely carried since her first appearance, and her asking it filled the gap naturally. He returned to the table, unpacking the last of his supplies, a small tin of tobacco, a coil of rope, and a sack of oats he hadn't mentioned yet. Taya watched his hands, studying how he handled each item. Then she said something that settled heavily between them. If they do come, I won't hide. Her tone held a steadiness that did not match her physical exhaustion, and Harlan understood immediately what she meant. She had run enough. She had been chased enough. She wouldn't go back to that life. You won't have to. His voice didn't rise, didn't waver, didn't change pace. It was simply a statement of intention. The fire burned stronger now, casting the walls in a warm, steady glow. Taya returned to the fabric, threading the needle without shaking this time, and began the first few stitches with calm, precise movements. Harlan watched her work for a long moment, then reached for the pot on the stove to prepare another cup of hot water, this time adding a pinch of the coffee the storekeeper had given him. When he set the cup beside her, she looked up, unsure if it was meant for her. He nodded once. She took it carefully, her hands warmer now, and brought it close enough to feel the steam. Outside, night settled over the land in a slow, broad sweep. Inside, the cabin didn't feel like two strangers sharing a space anymore. It felt like two people learning how to breathe in the same room without fear creeping in at the edges. For the first time since she arrived, Taya sewed with a steady rhythm that matched the quiet strength returning to her body. And for the first time in years, Harlan realized he wasn't guarding his home from someone. He was protecting someone inside it. By the next morning, the cabin held a quiet warmth that rose from the stove in soft waves. And Taya woke before Harlan for the first time since she arrived. The blanket he had given her lay neatly across her legs, and she pushed herself upright with care, noticing how the stiffness in her muscles had eased after a night of uninterrupted rest. The first thing she did was check the stove, making sure the embers still held enough heat to rekindle a flame, and she added a small piece of wood, tending it with practiced motions. These actions answered a question listeners might wonder, whether she intended to contribute to the home or simply rely on him. Her behavior showed she had never once planned to live passively. Harlan stepped out of his sleeping space a few moments later, rubbing a tired hand across his jaw as he glanced toward her. She stood near the stove, posture straight, the beginnings of a new garment folded beside her. She had made significant progress in a single evening, the stitched fabric already forming a shape warm enough for cold days. He registered the sight with a quiet sense of respect. then spoke in a voice still rough from waking. "You're up early." Her eyes lifted briefly. "You let me rest. I should help." The way she said it, simple, unforced, told him she was adjusting to the cabin's rhythm without being asked. He stepped closer to the table, noticing the small bowl of cleaned vegetables she had prepared, and realized she had been awake longer than he thought. She hadn't stayed idle while he slept. She had used the time to learn the kitchen, clean the counter, sort the supplies he brought, and begin sewing something warm for herself. The orderliness of the space reflected her presence, not his. She noticed him looking and shifted slightly, almost defensive. "I didn't move anything you might need," she said. "I kept things where they were." He shook his head lightly. "The way you said it makes more sense." Her shoulders eased at that small acknowledgement, a reaction she couldn't hide even if she tried. After they ate a simple breakfast, Taya inspected the stitching on the garment and resumed working on it, though she paused each time she lifted her arm too high. The strain hadn't disappeared completely. Harlan watched her wince once, then leaned forward and asked a question he hadn't brought up before. "Did you injure your shoulder when you fell near the porch?" She hesitated, then lowered her gaze. "I heard it 3 nights before that," she said. "I slipped on a rock after crossing the river. It hasn't healed right since." Harlan nodded slowly, processing this missing detail, a question listeners might have wondered about as soon as she struggled to stir the pot on that first night. He stood and went to the shelf, retrieving a small cloth bag containing powdered willow bark. "It'll take the ache down," he said, handing it to her with a steady hand. "Mix it with hot water. Not too much." She accepted it carefully, grateful not only for the remedy, but for the way he explained it without speaking down to her. Some men treated wounded women as weak. Harlan treated her as someone capable who needed tools, not pity. The room settled into a quiet routine as she prepared the mixture, her movements precise despite the soreness in her arm. Harlan fixed a hinge on the cabinet door, something he had meant to do weeks ago, but now felt necessary with someone else using the kitchen. The atmosphere between them held no strain, just the shared presence of 2 people adjusting to the reality of being in the same space. Then a sudden question cut the quiet. "What happens if your neighbors find out I'm here?" Taya asked without looking up, her voice steady. "Do they come often?" The question lingered with real fear behind it, a fear listeners might share. Harlan set the hinge in place, stood straight, and answered plainly. "I don't have neighbors close enough to wander in, and the ones farther out keep to themselves. They don't come unless they need something." She nodded, but didn't settle completely. "And if someone does come?" He paused, choosing his words with care. "Then they see you here because it's where you belong right now." The phrasing wasn't dramatic or symbolic. It was straightforward. She belonged here because she was here, and he wasn't going to hide her, move her, or tell her to vanish if someone rode into the yard. That understanding softened something deep inside her, something worn thin by months of being shuffled from one place to another. As the day progressed, Taya continued sewing while Harlan repaired the latch on the chicken coop outside. When he returned to the cabin, he found her standing near the door, peering through the crack in the shutters. Her expression held a tension he recognized instantly. "You hear something?" he asked quietly. She nodded once. A sound near the ridge. Far but not wind. Harlan stepped to the window and scanned the distant land. He didn't see movement, but he trusted the instincts of someone who had spent weeks listening for danger. He set his jaw, not wanting to alarm her, and spoke evenly. Could be a cow strayed from a neighboring ranch. They wander that way sometimes. She held the blanket closer to her body, unsure. He didn't dismiss her concern. He simply didn't want to assume the worst before knowing more. Still, he knew listeners might question the threat of the man who had been behind her. To address that subtle gap, he stepped outside, walked a few yards into the open, and crouched near the frost-tipped brush to check for disturbances. He found faint tracks, 2 sets, lightly pressed into the dirt from earlier in the morning. Nothing fresh, nothing urgent, but tracks meant someone had passed within a day. He returned to the cabin, brushing dirt from his glove, and Taya watched his face closely. He didn't lie. Tracks farther out. Not close. They're old enough they weren't made today. She exhaled slowly, tension easing but not disappearing fully. He added, "If anyone comes near this place, I'll know it before they get close." The confidence in his tone wasn't arrogance. It was earned through years of surviving alone on this land. Taya moved closer to the stove, the steady heat making her posture ease again, as she continued sewing with renewed focus. She didn't ask more questions about the tracks. She didn't need to. Harlan's presence told her she wasn't unprotected here. A short while later, she finished stitching the last seam and held up the garment with both hands. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't decorative. It was thick, practical, and warm, exactly what she needed to survive the coming cold. When she lifted it toward him, unsure if he wanted to inspect it, Harlan shook his head slightly. "If it fits you, that's what matters." She gave a faint nod and stepped behind the corner to put it on. When she reappeared, the garment fit her well, covering her shoulders and falling past her hips. The added warmth changed her posture. She stood with more ease, more steadiness, more presence. Harlan took in the sight with a quiet sense of satisfaction. Not admiration for the fabric, but relief that she had something to protect her from a cold. For the first time since arriving, she looked like someone prepared to face the harsh Wyoming air rather than someone barely surviving it. She walked to the table and gathered the remaining scraps, folding them neatly. "Thank you," she said softly. Harlan nodded once, not needing her gratitude, but accepting it with calm sincerity. Outside, the wind shifted again, carrying a distant echo from the ridge. Neither of them pretended it meant nothing, but neither stepped back in fear. Taya had warmth on her body, food in her stomach, and a man who didn't treat her as a burden. Harlan had someone inside his home who didn't disrupt the quiet, someone who made the place feel less like a room waiting for winter and more like a space meant to be lived in. And for the first time since she collapsed near his porch, both understood the same truth. Whatever danger lingered out there, neither of them faced it alone anymore. The next morning arrived with a pale, flat light that spread across the land without warmth, and Harlan Pike stepped outside before the sun had fully risen, wanting to check the perimeter again, now that Taya had voiced concern about movement near the ridge. He carried his rifle with deliberate care, scanning the ground for new tracks, and found only the faint imprints left by his own boots from the day before. The quiet held steady, no sign of riders, no broken brush, no freshly disturbed earth, and that steadiness eased the hard edge in his chest. Still, the silence after concern rarely meant safety forever. It simply meant nothing had reached the doorstep yet. Inside the cabin, Taya had already begun her morning, sorting the dried beans and flour they would need for the next meal. Her posture showed a slight stiffness from spending days recovering, but her movements were firmer than her first night here. When Harlan stepped through the doorway, she straightened instinctively, as if checking his expression for trouble. He set the rifle against the wall and shook his head once. "Nothing out there." Her breathing steadied at the words, though she didn't relax fully until he added, "Not a sign of anyone passing through." She nodded, acknowledging his report, and returned to the counter. But there was another question she had been carrying since yesterday: where exactly town was, how far danger might travel, and what kind of people lived nearby. Listeners might wonder the same. Harlan approached the table, rolling out a small, folded map he kept tucked in a drawer. He placed it between them, tapping a calloused finger on a marked spot. "Town's here," he said. "About an hour's ride if the trail stays clear." Then he pointed toward the ridge. "You crossed around here. Not many people travel that direction. Too steep." Taya leaned forward, studying the terrain with focused eyes, absorbing distances, landmarks, and paths she had traveled without ever seeing them drawn. "If those men were behind me," she murmured, "they would have come from this trail." She traced a small looping route with her fingertip. Harlan watched closely, noting her instinct for tracking. She wasn't guessing. She had learned these details through survival, not choice. She paused a moment, glancing toward the window. "I didn't know how close I was to anything," she admitted quietly. "I just kept walking because stopping felt worse." The admission contained more fear than the words themselves, and Harlan understood the weight behind them. She had traveled blind, with nothing but worn moccasins and determination holding her upright. Harlan folded the map neatly and placed it aside, then reached for the sack of oats he had brought home. "We'll make something hot," he said, giving her a small task without overwhelming her. She nodded and began sorting through the ingredients with a precision that showed she preferred doing the talking. As she worked, she winced when she lifted her arm too high, something he noticed immediately. "Let me see your shoulder," he said in a quiet but firm tone. She stiffened, unsure, then reluctantly pulled the new garment aside, just enough to expose the area. The bruise had deepened along the muscle, spreading in uneven patches across her upper arm. It was not infected, but it was worse than she had admitted the day before. Harlan examined it without touching it first, respecting her boundaries. "You need rest more than chores," he said. "That's not going to heal if you keep pushing it." She lowered her gaze, frustration tightening her jaw. "I can still work," she insisted. But Harlan shook his head once, clear and steady. "And you'll do more damage if you keep ignoring it." She looked away, not in defiance, but in recognition that he was right. She had survived by forcing her body to go farther than it could handle, but inside these walls, she didn't need to keep doing that. He prepared a compress with warm water and the salve she had used on her ankles, and when he handed it to her, she took it without argument, applying the mixture with careful pressure. Once she finished tending her shoulder, she set the compress aside and asked something she had avoided until now. "Why did you help me? You didn't know who I was. You didn't know what trouble followed me." Her tone held a sincerity she hadn't used before. Listeners likely wondered the same. Harlan leaned back against the counter, thinking before he answered. "You were dying on my porch," he said simply. "I wasn't going to leave you there." She waited for more, but he didn't add to it. He wasn't hiding anything. He just didn't dress up the truth. Her eyes softened slightly, absorbing the honesty. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but the sound of hooves in the distance cut her off abruptly. Both turned toward the window, tension spiking through the room. Harlan moved first, grabbing the rifle from the wall and stepping to the side of the window frame. "Stay low," he said quietly. Taya didn't argue. She crouched behind the table, keeping her injured shoulder pressed against her rib to prevent a noise that might give her away. Harlan peered carefully through the narrow opening between the shutters. A single rider approached slowly from the east, moving a lazy pace that didn't suggest danger. The man looked familiar. Broad shoulders, light beard, worn coat. "It's Evan Holbrook," Harlan said finally, lowering the rifle slightly, but not relaxing completely. "He's a rancher from across the valley. Usually comes when he loses a steer or needs help with tools." Taya's posture remained tight. "Does he know you live alone?" she whispered. Harlan nodded. "Everyone does." She swallowed, understanding the implication. If Evan saw her here, questions might follow. Questions she wasn't ready to face. Harlan stepped toward the door, speaking in a calm tone meant to guide her decisions. "Go to the back room. Stay quiet. He won't stay long." She hesitated only a second before moving toward the small space near the bed, pulling the edge of the blanket around her shoulders. She didn't hide because she was ashamed. She hid because she understood how vulnerable she remained in unfamiliar territory. Harlan opened the door just as Evan reached the porch. "Morning," Evan called out, adjusting his hat against the cold. "Thought you might have seen one of my steers wander this way." Harlan kept his expression neutral. "Haven't seen anything." Evan craned his neck slightly, glancing past Harlan into the cabin. "Looks like you're stocked up early for winter." Harlan stepped closer to the threshold, blocking the view. "Got what I needed from town yesterday." Evan nodded, but curiosity lingered in his eyes a moment longer. "You ever think about heading back to work with the cattle outfit? They still talk about how you handled that winter storm years back." Harlan shook his head once. "Not interested." Evan accepted the answer with a shrug, then touched the brim of his hat and rode off without pressing further. When hoofbeats faded, Harlan closed the door and exhaled slowly. Taya stepped out from the back room, her eyes scanning his face for signs of unseen trouble. He shook his head quietly. "He won't be back for a while." She let out a breath she had held through the entire exchange and sat down in the nearest chair, her hands trembling slightly from the tension. "Do many people come here?" she asked, trying to gauge how often she might need to hide. "Not often," he said. and not without reason. She nodded but didn't fully unwind. The fear of being discovered still lingered, not because she had done something wrong, but because she knew how fast strangers judged what they didn't understand. Harlan set the rifle back on the wall and knelt beside the table to gather the remaining pieces of dried wood. He didn't want her living in fear, but he also understood her caution. Next time, he said quietly, "You don't need to hide unless you want to." She looked at him with a searching expression. "Would it cause trouble if someone saw me here?" Harlan met her gaze directly. "If they ask questions, I'll answer them. You're here because you needed help. That's all they need to know." The firmness in his voice steadied her more than any promise could have. She lowered her eyes for a moment, letting the understanding settle between them, then lifted them again with a new clarity. She wasn't just surviving here now. She was being defended in a way she hadn't expected. As the stove warmed the room again and the tension eased, Taya returned to her seat by the table. She rested her injured shoulder carefully, but didn't withdraw into silence. Instead, she asked a question that carried more meaning than the words revealed. "What do you need me to do today?" Harlan paused, then answered with the simplest truth he had. "Stay warm, rest that arm, and don't run from anything." For the first time, she didn't argue. And for the first time, he realized he wasn't preparing the home just for winter. He was preparing it for someone else's presence. The cabin settled into a cautious quiet after Evan Holbrook rode away, and Harlan Pike watched Taya as she lowered herself into the chair near the stove, her hands still trembling slightly from the tension of hiding. The brief encounter had stirred questions listeners might ask. What would happen if someone did see her? How much danger followed her? And what steps Harlan intended to take to ensure safety? He leaned a rifle against the wall, crossed the room, and spoke with a calm steadiness meant to reassure her. He didn't see anything, and even if he had, Evan isn't the type to stir up trouble. Taya nodded slowly, though her posture remained tight, as if her body hadn't yet accepted the safety her mind wanted to believe. She braced her injured shoulder with her hand, pressing lightly to ease the ache. Harlan noticed the pain she tried to hide, and that small detail answered a question about how the injury affected her daily routine. He walked to the shelf, retrieved the salve again, and set it gently on the table. "Use more tonight," he said. "It'll help you sleep." She looked at the jar with a silent acknowledgement, appreciating not just the medicine, but the absence of pressure in his voice. He wasn't giving orders. He was showing concern. The afternoon hours passed quietly. Taya resumed sewing the last details of her garment, pausing often to adjust her shoulder, while Harlan chopped wood outside the cabin, wanting to build a supply large enough to last several days. He worked with long, steady strokes, stacking each split log in a tidy row against the cabin wall. From the window, Taya studied his movements, seeing not just strength, but the practiced discipline of someone who lived by routine rather than impulse. When Harlan carried the final load inside, he noticed Taya standing by the doorway, her new garment folded neatly over one arm. She cleared her throat gently to draw his attention. "I finished it," she said, "and I made something for you." She extended a small piece of fabric shaped into a simple, sturdy neck wrap. The stitches were tight, the edges clean. Listeners might have wondered whether she wished to give anything in return for the shelter and safety she had received. This answered that question without ceremony. Harlan accepted the item with a measured nod, running his thumb lightly across the stitching. "It's good work," he said. The brief praise made Taya's eyes soften, and she stepped aside to let him enter fully. She wasn't looking for gratitude. She only needed to know she contributed something of real use. As evening approached, clouds gathered over the valley, dark and heavy, hinting at snow that might arrive sooner than expected. Harlan stepped outside again, scanning the ridge with a cautious eye. Taya followed him to the doorway, wrapped in her new garment, her expression thoughtful. "When you said those tracks were old," she began, "do you think the men turned away? Or do you think they're still looking?" Her question wasn't born from panic, but from a need to understand the threat that shaped her every decision. Harlan rested one hand on the fence post, considering his reply. "If they were tracking you closely, they would have come through already. If they weren't sure which direction you took, then they might be searching elsewhere." She exhaled slowly, processing the uncertain but practical truth. So they could still be out there. He didn't soften the reality. Could be, but this land's wide, and you covered a lot of ground. The conversation opened another question listeners might hold: how long she had been traveling before collapsing at his door. Taya answered it on her own. I walked for 6 days after leaving the camp, she said quietly. For the last two, I didn't see anyone. I almost stopped moving on the fifth night. The admission carried no drama, only the clear truth of someone who had reached the limits of endurance and pushed past them because stopping meant dying. Harlan turned to face her fully. You're not on your own anymore. If someone comes this way, I'll know. She held his gaze, recognizing that he wasn't making promises he couldn't keep. He was stating a fact shaped by the land he understood better than anyone. They returned inside as the wind shifted again, blowing colder air through the cracks near the door. Taya fetched a strip of cloth and stuffed it along the bottom edge, noticing how Harlan watched her problem-solve small details without being asked. She moved around the cabin with more confidence now, familiar with the space, knowing where things were kept, adjusting the stove's airflow to steady the flame. These small motions filled gaps listeners might wonder about, whether she intended to integrate into the household or remain on the edge of it. Her actions made the answer clear. She was trying to belong in a place that hadn't rejected her. As night settled, Harlan prepared a pot of stew with the supplies they bought from town, and Taya watched the process with quiet interest, stepping in to help when needed. When he accidentally reached for a pot with his bare hand, she reacted instinctively, catching his wrist lightly to warn him. He paused, surprised by the contact, and she let go quickly, embarrassed. But the moment carried its own significance. It showed that she cared whether he burned himself, not simply because she needed him, but because she valued the life he lived. They ate in a calm silence, interrupted only by the sound of wind brushing against the cabin walls. When Taya finished her meal, she folded her hands in her lap, looking toward the fire with a distant expression. Harlan studied her quietly, recognizing the way her eyes shifted not with fear now, but with thought. You're thinking about going back for something, he said, reading the tension in her posture. She hesitated, then nodded once. I left something behind when I ran. Something I didn't want to lose. This answered another question listeners might have wondered, whether she had family or keepsakes still out there. She continued slowly. My husband carved a small pendant. I wore it every day. I dropped it when I fell near the river. I didn't have the strength to look for it. Harlan absorbed the detail with steady understanding. He didn't offer immediate comfort. Instead, he asked a practical question. Can you describe it? Taya nodded. Small, shaped like a leaf, tied with a thin leather cord. She swallowed. It was the only thing I carried once I left. Harlan considered the distance, the terrain, the fading daylight. We'll look for it when your arm heals. Her eyes widened slightly, not in disbelief, but in relief so deep she struggled to mask it. No one had offered to help retrieve anything precious to her since the night she lost her husband. She nodded, blinking against the weight of the moment, and looked down at her folded hands. The fire crackled softly, casting a deeper glow across the cabin walls. Taya leaned back slightly, her posture no longer tight with fear or uncertainty. Harlan watched her settle, appreciating the subtle shift in her demeanor. She was no longer bracing herself for rejection. She was planning the next day. Outside, snow began to fall in small, steady flakes, silent, fine, and early. The change in weather signaled the beginning of winter, a season neither of them expected to face together. But inside the cabin, the warmth felt different now. Not just because of the fire, not because of safety alone, because for the first time since she reached his porch, Taya wasn't surviving alone. And for the first time since he buried his brothers, Harlan wasn't living for himself anymore. Snow settled across the valley through the night, forming a thin, unbroken sheet that brightened the morning light as it crept into the cabin. Harlan Pike stood by the window before dawn, studying the ridge through the narrow opening between the shutters. The snowfall hid tracks and softened the land, answering a question listeners might have wondered, whether the men following Taya could still be close. Fresh snow meant anything moving near the ranch today would leave clear signs, making the land easier to read and safer to monitor. He let out a slow breath and stepped away from the window, satisfied that the morning brought no danger. Behind him, Taya pushed herself upright from the cot, wrapped in the warm garment she had finished sewing. Her hair hung loose over her shoulders, strands catching faint light from the stove. She watched Harlan's posture carefully, seeing how he held himself with a readiness that never fully faded. She pulled the blanket closer and asked in a low, steady voice, "Is anything out there?" Harlan shook his head. "Just snow." She nodded, letting the answer settle. Her shoulder ached less today, though she still moved with caution. She walked to the stove and stirred the embers gently, preparing the morning fire. Harlan noticed her movements had grown steadier, more confident inside the cabin. The small choices, tending the fire, handling supplies, adjusting the shutters, showed she saw this place not as temporary shelter, but as a space she now understood and belonged in. That subtle detail addressed another question listeners may have asked: whether she viewed this home as a stop along her running. Every action she took now suggested otherwise. As the fire warmed, she set oats in the pot and glanced toward him with an expression that carried new resolve. "You said we could look for the pendant when my arm got better," she said. "The snow may make it harder, but I don't want to lose the chance." There was no desperation in her tone, just a quiet urgency shaped by memory. Harlan took a seat at the table, considering the terrain and distance. "Where exactly did you lose it?" he asked. She sat across from him, tracing a small arc on the map with her fingertip. "Near the riverbank, on the east side of the canyon. I slipped on a rock, and the cord snapped." Her eyes held the weight of that night, the final piece of her old life falling away in a moment of pain and fear. Harlan studied the point she indicated. The place was isolated, surrounded by uneven ground and tall brush. It wasn't impossible to reach, but it wasn't simple either. "We'll go," he said, but not unprepared. The certainty in his voice steadied her, but another question rose in her eyes: whether she would slow him down with her injury. He answered before she said anything. "You walk steady now. You tell me if the pain comes back." She exhaled with quiet relief, grateful he didn't dismiss her wish or treat it as a burden. She finished preparing the oats and handed him a bowl, then served herself. They ate beside the stove, the warmth wrapping around them as snow continued falling outside. The silent meal held a calm that hadn't existed days ago. Taya wasn't watching him for signs of rejection anymore. She was watching to understand his pace. After breakfast, Harlan gathered supplies for the search: rope, a canteen, a small shovel in case the pendant was buried under snow, and a knife. He also packed wool gloves for her, placing them on the table without comment. Taya picked them up, turning them in her hands, then slipped them on with a small nod that showed gratitude without words. She adjusted the garment she had sewn, pulling it close around her shoulders, then stood with a resolve that showed she felt strong enough to face the cold. Before stepping outside, Taya hesitated near the door. Harlan noticed the pause. "What is it?" he asked. She looked at him with guarded sincerity. "If we don't find it today, I don't want you to feel responsible." He met her eyes directly. "I said we'd look. That's enough." The simple reassurance eased something deep inside her, something still shaped by months of being dismissed by others. They stepped outside together, the snow crunching softly beneath their boots. The air was sharp but calm, no wind to bite at their skin. Taya kept her steps measured, mindful of her shoulder, but she walked without hesitation. Their footprints formed a straight path across the yard toward the distant ridge. As they traveled, Taya spoke quietly, answering unspoken questions listeners might wonder. What her life had been like before she fled, how she survived alone, whether she had any family left. "My husband and I lived near the canyon with his extended family," she said. "After he died, things changed. His brothers argued over the land. Some said I brought bad luck. I didn't want to fight them." Her voice remained steady, though the memories clearly weighed on her. "When they told me to leave, I did. I didn't expect anyone to follow." Harlan listened, absorbing each detail without interrupting. He didn't judge her choices. He recognized survival when he heard it. They reached the riverbank more quickly than she expected. Snow covered the rocks where she had slipped days before, and Taya stopped at the edge, staring at the place where the cord had snapped. "It fell between these stones," she said, pointing to the narrow gap. Harlan nodded and knelt carefully, brushing snow aside with his glove. The search answered another question listeners might ask: how much she valued that pendant and why retrieving it mattered so deeply. "He carved it for me on our first winter together," she said quietly. "It was the only thing I carried when I left." Harlan worked the shovel gently between the stones, breaking packed frost and brushing it aside. Taya crouched nearby, helping sift through the sifted snow with slow, deliberate movements. For several minutes, they worked in silence, moving stones carefully, checking each crevice. Snow drifted lightly around them, settling in soft patches across the riverbank. Then Harlan paused, narrowing his eyes at a small glint caught between two rocks. He reached in with steady fingers and lifted a tiny object from the frozen gap. A carved wooden leaf, worn at the edges, the cord broken cleanly. Taya drew in a sharp breath, her eyes widening with an emotion she tried to contain but couldn't fully hide. He placed it in her open palm without a word. She held it tightly against her chest, her breath shaking once, not from cold, but from the sudden rush of memory. "I thought it was gone," she whispered. Harlan stood slowly, brushing snow from his gloves. "You came close to losing it," he said, "but it stayed where you dropped it." Taya looked at him with a quiet intensity, recognizing the weight of what he had done. She tied the broken cord carefully and slipped the pendant beneath her garment, pressing it against her skin as if anchoring part of herself back into place. A question listeners might hold: whether this pendant symbolized her past or her connection to her husband, was answered in her eyes. It was not an object of grief. It was a reminder of how far she had come. On the walk back, her steps grew lighter, the tension in her shoulders less rigid. Snow continued falling, but she didn't retreat into silence or fear. She walked beside Harlan with a steadiness that came from knowing she had something back that she thought was lost forever. When they reached the cabin, she stepped inside first, turning back to look at him with a calm, sincere expression. "Thank you for coming," she said. He nodded once, setting the shovel aside. "You'd have done the same." She didn't respond, but the truth settled between them just as firmly as the warmth inside the cabin. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt whole enough to think beyond survival. And for the first time since losing his brothers, Harlan felt the beginning of something he hadn't expected to find in a winter like this. Snow thickened across the Wyoming Valley by the time Harlan Pike and Taya returned to the cabin, soft flakes drifting in quiet patterns that muted every sound. The air carried a sharp chill, but neither of them rushed inside. Taya paused on the porch for a moment, her hand resting lightly against the doorframe as she adjusted the pendant beneath her garment. Her breathing came steady and calm, different from the fragile rhythm she'd had the night she arrived. The strength in her eyes reflected someone who had reclaimed something more than a keepsake. She had reclaimed a part of herself. Harlan watched her quietly, giving her space to settle into the moment before stepping inside. The warmth of the cabin wrapped around them the instant the door closed, and Harlan shook snow from his coat while Taya moved toward the stove to stir the embers. She didn't ask what came next, and he didn't offer instructions. Their movements flowed together naturally now, an ease formed from days spent learning each other's pace. This answered a question listeners might wonder: whether they had grown comfortable enough to move as a pair rather than two strangers sharing space. They had. Taya added a log to the stove and wiped her hands along the fabric of her handmade garment. The pendant rested beneath the cloth, its edges warm from her skin. She glanced toward Harlan, who was placing the supplies back on the shelf. "I didn't think I would ever see it again," she said, her voice low but steady. He nodded once. "Things get buried fast out here. Doesn't mean they can't be found." She watched him carefully, absorbing not just the words but the calm certainty behind them. She hesitated before speaking again, addressing another question the listeners might hold. What her future looked like now that she had reached safety. I don't know where I would have gone if you hadn't found me, she said. I didn't have another place to try. The statement held no fear now, only truth. Harlan crossed the room, leaned a hand on the table, and looked at her without shifting away. You don't have to think about leaving, he said. Not unless you want to. She held his gaze, searching for any hint of uncertainty in his voice. She found none. Snow pressed lightly against the shutters as the wind picked up outside. The firelight cast warm lines across the floor, and Taya moved closer to the table, her eyes softer than before. If I stay, she said, I don't want to take more than I give. Harlan shook his head, slow and firm. You've given plenty. She frowned lightly, unsure. What have I given? He answered without hesitation. Company. Purpose. Something worth looking after. The words caught her off guard, her breath tightening briefly as she absorbed the weight of what he'd said. She had spent so long being told she was a burden that hearing the opposite required a moment to settle. She stepped closer, the distance between them narrowing. For the first time since she'd arrived, she reached out and touched the edge of his coat, testing whether he would step back. He didn't move. Her fingertips rested gently against the heavy fabric while she studied his face. You've lived alone a long time, she said quietly. Does it feel strange having someone here? He shook his head once. It feels right. A small, steady silence filled the space between them. Not heavy, not uncertain, simply present. She lowered her hand, not because she pulled away, but because she was ready to speak what she had been holding back. I don't know what comes next, she admitted. I only know I feel safe here. Safe with you. Her voice didn't tremble. It carried clarity shaped by days of trust earned in quiet ways. Harlan breathed out slowly, relieved she felt what he did. He stepped aside only long enough to check the latched windows again, a gesture she now recognized as care rather than suspicion. When he returned to the table, he sat, and she joined him across from the warming stove. Another question listeners might have, whether the danger behind her would ever return. Harlan addressed it naturally. Track stayed gone, he said, and with this snow covering the trail, no one's following you through this valley. She nodded, not with blind faith, but with confidence in his judgment. She had watched him read the land for days. She trusted his eyes more than her own. Taya reached up, touched the pendant through her garment again, and smiled faintly. Not a bright or sudden gesture, but a quiet, grounded one filled with relief and belonging. I think this is where I'm meant to be, she said. The words carried no hesitation. Harlan felt the truth of it settle deeply in him. Warming a part of his chest he had forgotten could feel anything beyond duty. He leaned forward slightly. If you want to stay, he said, then stay as long as you want. Winters here are hard. Easier with two people than one. Her eyes lifted with something close to gratitude, but not the kind given to a stranger. Something closer to choice. Snowflakes brushed lightly against the window. Taya stepped toward him again, this time with unmistakable intent, and placed her hand over his. It rested there naturally, her fingers warm in his steady grip. Then I stay, she said quietly. If you want me here. He closed his hand around hers, not tight, not hesitant, just enough for her to feel the certainty behind it. I want you here, he replied. The fire crackled gently in the hearth. The snow deepened outside, and inside the small cabin, the final question held by listeners found its answer. Whether these two broken lives, brought together by cold and chance, would choose each other once the danger passed. They did. As the evening settled and the stove glowed warmly, Taya leaned her head lightly against Harlan's shoulder, a gesture with no fear left in it. He rested his hand over hers, steady and sure, knowing the winter ahead would be faced together. The door stayed shut against the cold. The home no longer felt empty, and the life that waited for both of them began with the simple, quiet act of staying.